Vampires did not disappear when humanity stopped digging up graves. They adapted, they changed, and eventually they found the perfect hiding place. Stories. For thousands of years, vampires belonged to folklore. They lived inside whispered warnings, isolated villages, and frightened communities who believed the dead could return from their graves. But as the world changed, so did the vampire. The creature once imagined as a bloated corpse wandering through the darkness slowly transformed into something entirely different. It became intelligent, elegant, beautiful. Not because the vampire itself had changed, but because humanity had. Every generation reshaped the monster to reflect its own fears, and no one changed the vampire more than the writers. One of the first stories to do so appeared in 1872. Its name was Carmilla. Long before Dracula became the world's most famous vampire, Sheridan Fanu introduced a creature unlike anything readers had seen before. Carmilla did not rely on violence. She didn't break into homes. She didn't claw her way out of graves. Instead, she earned trust. She spoke gently. She formed emotional connections. She became part of people's lives before revealing what she truly was. For centuries, vampire folklore had taught people to fear strangers arriving from the cemetery. Carmilla introduced something far more unsettling. What if the danger wasn't outside your home? What if you welcomed it inside yourself? The vampire was no longer simply a monster. It became temptation, obsession, manipulation, desire. The horror had moved away from the grave and into the human mind. But only 25 years later, another novel would transform the vampire forever. Its name was Dracula. Most people assumed Dracula was simply another vampire story. It wasn't. It became the foundation for almost everything that followed. Before Bram Stoker ever began writing his novel, Europe already knew the name of a man whose cruelty had become legendary. They're known today as Vlad the Impaler. Living during the 15th century, Vlad earned his reputation through one of history's most brutal methods of execution: impalement. Thousands of enemies were reportedly left displayed on wooden stakes. Entire forests of bodies were set to surround his castles. Stories of his brutality spread throughout Europe, turning Vlad into something larger than life. Centuries later, while researching Eastern European history and folklore, Bram Stoker encountered the name Dracula. The name itself came from Vlad's father, Vlad Dracul, whose title referred to the Order of the Dragon. Dracula simply meant son of Dracul. Whether Stoker intended Count Dracula to be a fictional version of Vlad himself remains debated, but the connection was enough. History had given fiction its perfect name. And from that moment forward, the world's most famous vampire was born. Dracula did something no vampire story had ever accomplished before. It gathered centuries of folklore, superstition, history, religion, and human fear into a single character. Count Dracula was not a mindless corpse clawing his way out of a grave. He was educated, patient, charming. He understood people. he could cross borders unnoticed, blend into high society, and hide ancient hunger behind perfect manners. That was terrifying, because by the end of the 19th century, humanity had begun fearing something different. Industrial cities were growing, international travel was becoming easier. Diseases spread faster than ever before. People worried about strangers arriving from distant places bringing with them something invisible, something impossible to stop. Dracula reflected those fears perfectly. He wasn't simply a monster, he was contamination, he was temptation. He was the fear that evil could wear a human face, smile politely, and ask to be invited inside. The novel became an international success, and although Bram Stoker never lied to witness it, he had created something extraordinary. Dracula was no longer just a character. He had become the blueprint for the modern vampire. For the next century, every vampire story would either follow Dracula or deliberately try to escape his shadow. Then, cinema arrived, and the vampire changed once again. In 1922, German audiences were introduced to a creature that looked nothing like the elegant Count Dracula. His name was Count Orlok. The film was called Nosferatu. Unlike Dracula, Orlok wasn't handsome. He wasn't charming. He wasn't someone you would willingly trust. He was thin. He was almost skeletal, completely bald, with impossibly long fingers, sunken eyes, and sharp animal-like teeth. He looked less like an aristocrat and more like something that had never fully belonged among the living. In many ways, Nosferatu felt closer to the vampires described in old European folklore than Bram Stoker's noble count. He brought plague wherever he traveled. Entire streets emptied after his arrival. Death seemed to follow him like a shadow. And perhaps that is why one scene from the film continues to haunt audiences more than 100 years later. Not the attacks, not the blood, but the shadow. And I'm sure you know which scene I'm talking about right now. A silent silhouette, slowly climbing a staircase, a hand stretching across a bedroom wall. Without showing violence, the film managed to capture something far older than horror itself. The feeling that death had already entered the room, long before anyone realizes it's there. But vampires would not remain monsters forever. By the second half of the 20th century, writers had begun asking a different question. Not, how do we survive the vampire? But, how does the vampire survive eternity? That single question changed everything. In 1976, American author Anne Rice published Interview with the Vampire. It wasn't simply another vampire novel. It was a confession. For the first time, readers experienced immortality through the vampire's own eyes. The monster was no longer hunting the story's protagonist. The monster was the protagonist. Louis wasn't terrifying because he killed. He was terrifying because he couldn't stop questioning himself. He was terrifying because he couldn't stop questioning himself. Every life he took, every century he survived, every person he loved, became another reason to hate the immortality he could never escape. Across from him stood Lestat. Everything Louis feared, Lestat embraced. Charismatic, cruel, theatrical. He didn't apologize for being a predator. he celebrated it. Together, they represented two completely different ways of surviving forever, one consumed by guilt, the other by hunger. But perhaps Anne Rice's greatest contribution wasn't either of those characters. It was the idea that vampires could feel, not simple emotions, but unbearable ones. Grief, loneliness, jealousy, regret, love. For centuries, vampire stories had asked whether the living could escape the dead. And Rice asked something entirely different. What happens when the dead can never escape themselves? Suddenly, immortality no longer looked like a gift. It looked like a sentence. An endless existence where every mistake, every loss, and every memory would follow you forever. And there was nowhere more fitting for those stories than one city in particular, New Orleans. Its narrow streets, iron balconies, above-ground cemeteries, gas lamps glowing through heavy summer nights, felt as though they had been waiting for vampires long before fiction ever placed them there. And Rice didn't just write about New Orleans. She became inseparable from it. Her novels transformed the city into one of the most recognizable vampire settings in the world. Even today, it's difficult to walk through the French Quarter after sunset without feeling as though one of her characters might appear around the next corner. Because after Anne Rice, the vampire no longer belonged only to castles. It belonged to cities, to memories, to broken families, to love stories, and perhaps most importantly, to us. By the late 1990s, the vampire had changed once again. It was no longer confined to gothic novels or horror films. It had become part of everyday life. In 1997, Buffy the Vampire Slayer arrived, and with it, the vampire left the castle behind. Instead of ancient ruins, there were classrooms, shopping malls, small town streets, teenagers balancing homework, relationships, and creatures that had existed for centuries. Buffy understood something earlier vampire stories had only hinted at. Growing up already feels terrifying. Your body changes, your emotions become unpredictable. The person you were yesterday slowly disappears, and someone new begins taking your place. The vampire became the perfect metaphor for that transformation. It was no longer simply something to survive. Sometimes it was something you could become. Then came another turning point. In 2005, Twilight introduced vampires to an entirely new generation. Whether people loved it or mocked it, its impact was impossible to ignore. For the first time in decades, vampires were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were everywhere. Bookstores, movie theaters, magazine covers, internet forums, fan communities, the vampire had become mainstream again. But this version of the vampire looked very different. It wasn't defined by horror. It was defined by restraint. The central question was no longer, can I survive the vampire? It became, can the vampire survive its own nature? The monster had become conflicted, and audiences embraced it. Only a few years later, another series pushed that idea further. In 2009, the Vampire Diaries arrived. Instead of asking whether vampires were monsters, it asked whether monsters could still be human. Its world expanded far beyond a single family or a single town. It explored centuries of history, broken families, betrayal, loyalty, power, and the emotional cost of living forever. Every vampire represented a different response to immortality. Some fought their nature, some surrendered to it. Others convinced themselves there was never a choice to begin with. The vampire was no longer defined by its fangs. It was defined by the weight of eternity. And perhaps nothing illustrates the cultural impact of these stories better than something that exists in the real world. In New Orleans, there is a small memorial bench, not dedicated to a historical figure, not to a real victim, but to Klaus and Elijah Michelson, two fictional vampires. Their names are permanently engraved into a city that has inspired vampire legends for generations. Think about that for a moment. For centuries, people drove wooden stakes through corpses because they feared vampires might rise from the dead. Today, people leave flowers, take photographs, and sit beside a memorial dedicated to vampires that never existed at all. Somewhere along the way, the monster became part of our culture. Not because we stopped fearing it, but because we started understanding it. But the vampire stories, they never truly ended. They simply stopped belonging only to fiction. Walk through New Orleans after sunset, and you'll still find vampire tours winding through narrow streets, occult shops selling protective charms beside antique stores, historic cemeteries standing only a few blocks away from jazz clubs. The city has embraced vampires so completely that fiction and folklore often feel impossible to separate. And for some people, they are. Even today, communities identifying as modern vampires continue to exist. Some describe themselves as psychic vampires, believing they absorb emotional or spiritual energy rather than blood. Others identify as sanguinarians, consenting adults who practice controlled blood rituals within trusted relationships. Most reject Hollywood stereotypes. Many avoid publicity altogether. Some insist they aren't role-playing. They believe this is simply who they are. Whether those beliefs are psychological, spiritual, or something else entirely depends on who you ask. But perhaps that isn't the most interesting question. Because vampire stories were never only about blood. They were never only about immortality or monsters. Every generation creates the vampire it needs. When humanity feared disease, the vampire carried plague. When society feared outsiders, the vampire arrived from distant lands. When people feared temptation, the vampire became beautiful. When loneliness became one of modern life's greatest burdens, the vampire became immortal. Searching endlessly for someone who could understand eternity, the face kept changing, but the fear underneath remained the same. Maybe that is why vampires have survived for so long. Not because anyone proved they were real, but because every generation found a new reason to believe in them. The corpse became an aristocrat. The aristocrat became a lover. The lover became a hero. The hero became an anti-hero. And somewhere beneath every version, beneath every novel, every film, every television series, every legend whispered after midnight, the oldest vampire still waits. Not the one hiding inside a castle, not the one sparkling beneath the sun, not the one walking through New Orleans, the one humanity has carried with it for thousands of years. Because perhaps the vampire never evolved at all. Perhaps we did. Some monsters are born, some are made, and some only appear once every month. Lock your doors. Keep an eye on the moon. And if you hear something howling outside, pretend you heard nothing. I'll see you in the next file.